It was a hot and humid morning in the southern United States. The local courthouse, an old building with columns worn down by time, was crowded that day. David Williams, a 35-year-old black man, sat in the defendant's chair, accused of a crime he knew he didn't commit, the brutal murder of a young white woman. Beside him, his wife Lisa clutched their children's hands tightly, fear and anguish etched across their faces. David was a hard-working man, known in the community for his dedication to his family and church. He had never imagined he would find himself in such a situation. The eyes of the people in the courtroom judged him, and he could feel the coldness of their gazes. It seemed everyone had already condemned him before the trial even began. Judge Robert Albright, a 55-year-old man with gray hair and a stern expression, sat behind the bench. He was known for his rigid demeanor and his thinly veiled racist views. For years, Albright had presided over cases with an obvious bias, especially when the defendants were black men. On that day, he was about to do what many expected him to do: convict another guilty man. David's defense attorney was young and inexperienced, visibly nervous. The evidence presented was flimsy and inconclusive: a weapon with no fingerprints from David, witnesses with contradictory testimonies, and a single statement from a criminal informant clearly seeking favors in exchange for cooperation. David looked at his lawyer with a mixture of fear and frustration. He wanted to scream, wanted someone to hear his truth, but the courtroom seemed deaf to his pleas. His eyes found Lisa's, who sat in the front row. She was trying to be strong, but tears silently streamed down her face. Their children, too young to grasp the gravity of what was happening, looked on in confusion. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. The word echoed through the room like a fatal blow. David felt a crushing weight on his chest. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment as he tried to process what had just happened. Judge Albright, without any hesitation or compassion, looked directly at David and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. It was as though David's life had been ripped from his hands, along with the future of his family. He looked at Lisa one last time as the officers led him away. She was breaking down in tears, and David felt deep pain for leaving her alone to raise their children. His mind was consumed by despair. How could an innocent man like him be convicted so easily? As the guards led him through the cold courthouse corridors, David heard his lawyer's words echoing in his mind: "If we don't fight, they win." But how could he fight against a system so corrupt and cruel? He wondered if he had the strength to survive 30 years of a prison sentence he knew was unjust. The weight of uncertainty crushed his hopes, but an inner voice insisted that his story couldn't end like this. 20 years had passed since David Williams was convicted, and although time had worn down his body, the real burden on his shoulders was something else. He knew the system had been against him from the start. The color of his skin had condemned him long before any trial. Even so, deep in the prison, something still kept him going, a thread of hope that someone, somewhere, believed in his innocence. Far away, in a larger city, James Carter, a 32-year-old black lawyer, spent his nights reviewing old case files in his cramped office. He was an idealist, but also a realist. He knew how deeply racism was embedded in the justice system. As a black lawyer, James faced the same prejudice every day that kept men like David in prison for crimes they hadn't committed. For James, this wasn't just another case. He knew what it felt like to be judged by the color of his skin before even speaking. He knew that, like David, many other black men had been convicted not by evidence, but by the color of their skin. And when James saw David Williams' name in the files, something ignited inside him. This case needed to be revisited. When James entered the prison to meet David for the first time, the contrast between their lives wasn't as great as most people would think. Yes, James was free, educated, and a licensed lawyer, but when he looked into David's eyes, he saw something familiar. Both were up against a system that didn't want them there. The difference was that James, at least, could still fight from the outside. David, now 55, looked at James with distrust. After 2 decades, he had grown accustomed to not believing in promises. Promises were for those with power, and he had never had any. James, with his simple suit and determined gaze, sat across from him, knowing it wouldn't be easy to convince a man who had lost everything. "Mr. Williams, I know you've heard this before," James began, his voice filled with empathy, "but I believe in your innocence, and I'm here to fight for it." David slowly raised his gaze, studying the young man already marked by battles. The fact that James was also black didn't escape David's notice. He knew what it meant to fight against a system that saw you as a problem before seeing you as a person. The connection between them, though unspoken, was clear. Both were survivors of different aspects of the same racist system. "Do you really believe a black man can win this game?" David's question was filled with skepticism and bitterness, emotions prison had taught him to feel. James didn't hesitate. "I know the fight is tough. I live it every day. But I'm not here to promise miracles. I'm here to promise that we'll fight, together." David was silent, absorbing those words. There was something in James's tone that felt different. Maybe it was their shared experience, or maybe it was the fact that James had also faced distrustful stares in courtrooms full of white men. For the first time in years, David allowed himself to feel something resembling hope. "Do you think you can take them on?" David asked. "They won't make it easy for you." James looked directly into David's eyes, unwavering. "I don't expect them to. And I won't give up. If there's a chance to right this wrong, we're going to take it." As the guards led David back to his cell, James left the prison with renewed strength. He knew the battle ahead would be more than difficult, and that the enemies weren't just the prosecutors and judges who had convicted David, they were the system itself, a system designed to fail men like David and like himself. But James was ready. He wasn't just fighting for David's freedom, he was fighting for something bigger, justice for all those unjustly condemned because of their race. As James left the prison, his phone rang. He answered, unsure of what to expect. A cold, threatening voice spoke on the other end. "You should know this case isn't for you, Carter. There are people who don't want this reopened. Be careful what you do." James's heart raced. He hung up the phone, glancing around as if expecting to see something out of the ordinary, but the street was quiet. He knew then that he wasn't just dealing with an old trial, he was stirring something much bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. And now, more than ever, he felt he wasn't just fighting for David, but for himself and for all the others who the system judged without mercy. The days that followed were intense for James Carter. He knew the key to freeing David lay in the overlooked details of the past. As soon as he returned to his office, he dove into the files, combing through every piece of evidence that might offer a clue. Something was very wrong with that trial, and he was determined to find out what it was. The case seemed like a poorly assembled puzzle. The key testimony from an informant with a long criminal record had been accepted as truth without any serious questioning. Witnesses who could have corroborated David's alibi were never heard. James, with the help of his team at a non-profit organization, began making calls and visits, trying to track down those forgotten witnesses. He also realized that certain evidence, like a weapon found at the crime scene, had never been properly tested for fingerprints or DNA, something unthinkable by today's standards. As he made progress, James was able to locate one of the case's key witnesses, an elderly woman named Margaret Doyle. At the time, she lived in the neighborhood and could have confirmed that David wasn't at the crime scene when the murder occurred, but fear had silenced her voice. When James found her, Margaret was in a nursing home, but her memory was still clear enough to recall the events of that fateful night. "I knew that man wasn't there. I saw him leave the market before everything happened," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But, the police, they told me it was better not to get involved. I was scared, you know? They made me feel like if I spoke up, I'd get into trouble too." James listened, his heart racing. There was the first real piece of hidden truth. He thanked Margaret for her testimony and promised he would do everything he could to make sure her voice was finally heard. As he returned to his car, James felt the weight of the situation. Not only was David's case full of flaws, but now he knew there was more at stake. There were active forces trying to keep the truth buried, and the mysterious phone call from days earlier still echoed in his mind. The pressure was mounting. but he also felt he was getting closer. In the days that followed, James achieved another major victory. After weeks of requests, he obtained permission to conduct a new DNA analysis on a piece of evidence neglected during the original trial, a hair found at the crime scene that had never been tested. He knew this test could be the key to unraveling the entire case. As he waited for the results, the threats began to escalate. At first, they were just short and vague messages. But soon, the threats became more intense. One day, after a long afternoon of work, he left his office and found his car with slashed tires and a note on the windshield, "Stop, or it'll get worse." The warning was clear, but instead of backing down, James felt his resolve harden. He knew he was close to something big, and he wasn't going to quit now. If someone was trying to intimidate him, it only meant he was on the right track. That same night, the phone rang again, this time with news from the DNA analysis clinic. The scientist in charge informed James that the results were ready. His heart pounded as he listened to the words that would change everything. "The DNA found at the scene does not match David Williams," the forensic expert said. "It belongs to someone else." James could hardly believe it. He had done it. Physical evidence that could overturn David's conviction was now in his hands. As he hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew this discovery could reverse the case, but he also knew that those who didn't want to see David free would act quickly. The real test was yet to come. The next day, as he prepared the documents for the next step in court, James received an unexpected email. In it, an anonymous person claimed to know who had really committed the crime and offered proof. The information in the message was too detailed to ignore. "I can prove who was really there that night. But be careful, digging into this could cost you dearly." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had uncovered more than he had expected, and now he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. The truth was lurking, but someone was willing to do anything to ensure it stayed hidden. James knew he was treading dangerous ground. The anonymous email had left him suspicious but also intrigued. The information it contained was detailed and convincing, too compelling to ignore. The person behind the message seemed to know more than anyone else about what really happened that night, 2 decades ago, and promised evidence that could finally clear David Williams' name. As James reviewed the documents and the new DNA evidence, he felt an invisible presence weighing on his shoulders. The threats he had been receiving were becoming more direct, and he knew he was getting closer to something much bigger than just a judicial error. At the same time, he began noticing patterns of resistance from the local authorities. Every time he tried to move forward in court, obstacles appeared. It was as if someone, or something, was blocking every step he took. Things became even more complicated when his request to bring the DNA results to court was suddenly delayed by bureaucratic issues, a blatant maneuver to buy time. But James wasn't willing to back down. That afternoon, he decided to confront one of the most powerful men in the city, former Judge Robert Albright. James knew Albright had influential contacts and that, somehow, he was behind the difficulties cropping up. Albright, now retired, lived a comfortable life in a large mansion on the outskirts of the city, far from the turmoil surrounding David's case. James drove to the former judge's property with a pounding heart. He knew the confrontation would be tense, and that Albright wouldn't welcome him with open arms. When he arrived, a House staff member led him to a luxurious office where Albright waited behind a massive wooden desk, his cold eyes fixed on James. "I know what you're doing, Carter," Albright said before James could even sit down. "And frankly, I'm tired of watching you waste your time." James remained standing, watching the man who had sentenced David years ago. Albright now had grayer hair and a face marked by time, but he still carried the same aura of arrogance and authority. "I'm not wasting my time, Judge," James said firmly. "I'm correcting an injustice that's been ignored for 20 years. And now, with the new DNA evidence, it's only a matter of time before everyone knows you convicted an innocent man." Albright offered a cold smile, showing no signs of remorse. "I did what was necessary to maintain order. You can chase after your DNA tests, interview witnesses, but in the end, it won't get you anywhere. Powerful people don't fall, James. The system was built to protect us. James felt a chill at those words. He knew he was dealing with someone who believed himself untouchable. But before he could respond, Albright continued. You're poking the wrong person. David Williams' case is closed. And I suggest you stop here while you still have a chance to save your career. James stared at him, blood boiling in his veins. And what about the real culprit? The person who actually committed the crime? For a brief moment, something shifted in Albright's expression. It was subtle, but James noticed. The judge knew more than he let on. Before Albright could react, James dropped the next bombshell. I know the killer is someone important in this city. And I'm very close to exposing everything. Albright remained silent. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. If you think you can mess with these people and walk away unscathed, you're more naive than you seem. James felt the weight of the threat but didn't back down. He knew he was on the right path, and despite all the power Albright and his allies wielded, he had something they couldn't ignore, the truth. As James left the former judge's mansion, his phone rang again. It was the same anonymous number that had sent him the message. You're closer than you think, Carter, said the voice on the other end of the line. But now you need to be careful. The man you're looking for, he's untouchable. A senator's son. And he'll do anything to keep his name clean. James felt a mix of anger and apprehension. Now everything made sense. The real murderer was none other than the son of a powerful senator, protected by a network of power that went far beyond the local judicial system. Exposing this person could bring down more than just a wrongful conviction, it could reveal an entire web of corruption. Why are you helping me? James asked, trying to understand the anonymous person's motivation. The voice responded coldly. Because I'm tired of watching these people manipulate the system. But be careful. If you keep going, you'll find out just how far they're willing to go to protect their own. As he hung up the phone, James felt the weight of the battle he was about to face. It wasn't just about freeing David anymore. It was about exposing a network of power and corruption involving figures far more influential than he had ever imagined. After the revelation that the real killer was the son of a powerful senator, James felt as if the ground were crumbling beneath his feet. He was used to fighting an unjust system, but this time, the enemy wasn't just a corrupt judicial system, it was a web of political power that stretched far beyond the courtroom. In the days that followed, James doubled his efforts to bring the new evidence to court. The DNA test exonerating David was ready to be presented, but every time he tried to file the documents, he encountered bureaucratic obstacles. Mysteriously lost requests, hearings postponed without explanation, the noose was tightening. It was obvious that powerful forces were working to block his progress. The pressure on James began to mount. The threats he received became more sinister. That morning, when he left his house, he found a message spray-painted on the hood of his car, "Stop now or pay the price." James knew he was taking risks, but he was determined to see it through. However, he wasn't alone. Lisa, David's wife, who had stood by her husband throughout the years, was now more involved in the case than ever. She knew this was their last chance to save David and bring some peace to their family. "I won't let them intimidate me," James said as he discussed the latest developments with Lisa. "They want to scare me, but we have something they don't, the truth." Lisa looked at him with tired but determined eyes. "We'll do whatever it takes. I can't bear to see my husband punished for something he didn't do any longer. These years have stolen so much from us." As James continued his investigation, he received a phone call from an unexpected source. It was someone who worked at the courthouse, a low-ranking employee who had seen up close the manipulations happening behind the scenes. The person, clearly nervous, offered to help as long as they remained anonymous. "You can't trust anyone around here, Carter," said the voice, trembling with fear. "They control everything. The judges, the prosecutors, they're all in their pocket. But I've seen the documents they tried to hide, the orders to delay your case. They won't stop until they crush you." James knew this was his chance to turn the tide. With the help of this informant, he could access the behind-the-scenes maneuvers that were preventing David's case from moving forward. But he also knew he was becoming increasingly exposed. Days later, James finally secured a hearing to present the new DNA test. The case was scheduled to be heard by Judge Willard, someone James had believed to be impartial until now. He wasn't sure if he could trust anyone in that courthouse. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. The local media had begun covering the case, and there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. David was brought into the courtroom, shackled but with a spark of hope in his eyes that hadn't been seen in decades. Lisa sat in the front row, holding the hands of their now adult children, all of them anxious for justice. James presented the DNA evidence and called for David's conviction to be overturned immediately. His argument was solid, the evidence was clear, but Judge Willard seemed hesitant. For a moment, it appeared he was about to delay the decision again, giving more time for the powerful forces behind the scenes to act. As the courtroom watched with bated breath, the door suddenly burst open. A man entered, visibly agitated, and handed an envelope to Judge Willard. James recognized the man. It was the anonymous informant who had promised to help him. The contents of the envelope left the judge visibly shaken. Willard looked at the papers, then at James, and then at the room full of spectators. The silence was suffocating. Finally, the judge took a deep breath and announced that the new evidence had to be considered immediately. But before the judge could finalize his decision, one of the defense attorneys for the prosecutor's side abruptly stood up. "This is a farce," the attorney shouted, his voice filled with rage. "We cannot allow such a fragile case to be reopened based on last-minute evidence. There are too many other considerations that need to be made before any hasty moves." The prosecutor, who had remained calm until now, suddenly looked tense. James knew he was being pressured by those who wanted to keep David in prison, or more importantly, protect the real killer. Judge Willard, visibly nervous, called for a recess to consider the matter, but James knew time was running out. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt a tug on his coat sleeve. It was the informant, wide-eyed and trembling. "You're dealing with very dangerous people," the man whispered. "If you keep going, they won't stop until they destroy you." James looked at the man and responded with determination, "I won't stop. Not now." As the informant turned to leave, James's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a new message, this time from the same anonymous contact who had warned him before. He quickly read the screen, and the revelation left him frozen. The prosecutor trying to block the case was directly connected to the senator, the father of the real killer. Everything now made sense. The conspiracy, the obstacles, the threats, it was all connected. James knew the road ahead would be even more dangerous, but now he was determined to expose the entire truth, even if it cost him his own safety. James knew that discovering the connection between the prosecutor and the senator made his situation much more dangerous. He had stepped into territory few dared to tread. Powerful people were willing to do anything to protect their secrets, and James was the most imminent threat. In the days following the hearing, he felt the tension rising around him. The threats were no longer just words or notes, the shadow of danger was closing in. One afternoon, while reviewing his documents in the office, the phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but James was used to anonymous calls by now. With a heavy sigh, he answered. "You should have stopped when I warned you," the voice said, cold and emotionless. "Now it's too late. They're coming for you, Carter. And when they do, there will be no one to save you." Before he could respond, the line went dead. James stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He knew the threat was real, and that something much worse was about to happen. That night, as he drove home, the headlights of a car appeared in his rearview mirror, blinding his vision. The vehicle sped toward him, and James felt the tension rise. Suddenly, the car began ramming into his, pushing him toward the side of the road. Panic took over as he struggled to keep control of the steering wheel. "They're trying to kill me," he thought, heart racing. The car behind him hit him hard once again, and James lost control, swerving off the road and crashing into a concrete barrier. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as the impact threw him forward, causing the car to spin and crash violently. For a moment, silence engulfed the scene. James was dazed, his face cut by shards of glass, but he was alive. The car that had hit him disappeared into the night, leaving him alone, injured, and confused on the roadside. With difficulty, James reached for his phone, his hands trembling. He knew he couldn't stay there. This hadn't been an accident, it was an attempt to silence him. His enemies were growing desperate. At the hospital, as he received medical attention, Lisa came to see him. The look of worry on her face reflected the growing fear that surrounded them all. She knew James was in danger, but now, after the attack, the reality of the threat had become even clearer. "You need to get out of this, James," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "They're going to kill you. We can't risk that." James looked at her, but his resolve didn't waver. "If I give up now, they win. I can't let David keep paying for a crime he didn't commit while the real culprit walks free." Lisa held his hand tightly, tears in her eyes, but she knew James wouldn't stop. Even after everything, he was more determined than ever. And she knew he had to see this through to the end. From the hospital, James contacted his allies and made a decision. He could no longer operate in the shadows. The only way to win was to expose the entire corruption to the public eye. The national media was already starting to pay attention to the case, but he knew that to bring down the senator and his son, he would need something bigger. In the days that followed, he organized a press conference. Armed with the DNA results and the newly discovered connections between the prosecutor and the senator, he put together a comprehensive dossier. James knew the power of influencing public opinion was his last weapon. If he could get the case in the national spotlight, the pressure would become unbearable even for the powerful. The press conference was scheduled for a Saturday morning, in front of the courthouse. Journalists from various news outlets were present, cameras positioned, and the world was about to hear the truth that had been hidden for so long. David, now informed about the dangers James faced, asked to be present. He no longer wanted to be a mere spectator in his own life. As James stepped up to the podium, he felt the weight of the moment. The evidence was there: documents, DNA results, testimonies from witnesses who had been ignored. He knew that once he began, there would be no turning back. But that was exactly what he wanted. It was time to expose the truth. "We are here today to correct a grave injustice that has lasted 2 decades, James began, his voice firm. David Williams was wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit, and the evidence we present today clearly shows he is innocent." The cameras captured every word, and reporters scribbled furiously. James continued, detailing how the justice system had failed David, how the evidence had been neglected, and how the real murderer, protected by his father's power, had escaped justice. For 20 years, the truth has been buried under layers of corruption and influence. But now, there is nowhere left to hide. The evidence is here. The DNA, the witnesses, and the direct connection between the prosecutor and the real killer. Today, we are here to ensure that this injustice is finally corrected. James spoke with a clarity that captivated everyone, and the public couldn't take their eyes off what was happening. Every word was a blow against the power structure that had protected the real criminal. The senator and his son could no longer hide. When James finished, a wave of murmurs passed through the crowd of journalists and spectators. The press had everything they needed, the truth was finally in full view. The power that had kept David in prison for a crime he didn't commit was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes. As James stepped down from the podium, he felt the weight of the moment, a mixture of relief and caution. He knew the battle wasn't completely over. David's trial still had to be officially reopened, but he also knew that, with public opinion now on his side and the undeniable evidence, it was only a matter of time before justice was served. Lisa hugged him as soon as he was finished. "You did it," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "We did it." James smiled, exhausted but relieved. It had been a long and arduous fight, and although he knew there were still more obstacles ahead, the biggest one had been overcome. The truth could no longer be ignored, and David was closer than ever to being a free man. Back at his office that night, as he reflected on everything that had happened, his phone vibrated with a new message. It was from the anonymous informant. "You've shaken the system. Now they know they can't stop you. Keep fighting." James set the phone aside, feeling that, despite everything, he was finally winning this war. Deep down, he knew his enemies would still try something, but the power of the evidence and public opinion was now working in his favor. The car incident, the press conference, and the threats were clear signs that they were desperate. But now, with everything out in the open, the people protecting the real killer were cornered. James knew that if he stayed firm, the day would soon come when David Williams could finally walk free, no longer bound by the chains of an injustice that had lasted so long. The courtroom was packed that morning. The atmosphere was tense, and all eyes were fixed on Judge Willard, who would soon decide David Williams' fate. The press was out in full force, fueled by the scandal of the attempted assassination of James during the press conference and the new revelations about the senator and his son's involvement in the case. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the conclusion of a story that had lasted more than 2 decades. David was brought into the courtroom. He was calm, but his gaze conveyed a restrained sense of expectation. Beside him, James Carter prepared for the final battle. He knew his enemies would do anything to delay or prevent the decision, but on that day, the truth would finally be exposed, and the world was watching. The judge began the proceedings, his expression one of absolute seriousness. James once again presented the new evidence, backed by the weight of the testimonies, the DNA analyses, and the corruption connections that had been uncovered between the prosecutor and the senator. The case against David had fallen apart, and the only remaining question was how much longer the truth could be denied. The prosecutor, visibly shaken, made one last attempt to discredit the new evidence. But everyone in the room knew it was a desperate move. James remained composed, countering each argument with the clarity and strength of the facts. The silence was palpable as he rose to make his final statement. "Your Honor, this court has seen how an innocent man was betrayed by a corrupt system, kept in prison for 20 years for a crime he did not commit. The truth is clear now. The evidence is undeniable. And today, we are not only here to free David Williams, but to show that justice can still prevail, even in the face of power and corruption. There is no more to debate. He is innocent, and the real culprit is in plain sight for all of us to see." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, until Judge Willard took a deep breath and addressed the court. "The court acknowledges the new evidence presented and, in light of the clarity and seriousness of the proof, overturns David Williams' conviction." He paused, his eyes settling on David. "You are free." Those words echoed through the room almost surrealistically. For a second, David seemed unable to believe what he had heard. He looked at James, tears welling in his eyes, while Lisa, in the front row, sobbed with emotion. The feeling of relief and disbelief washed over everyone. David was free. As his handcuffs were removed, David could barely stand. He walked over to Lisa and their children, who enveloped him in an embrace that had been delayed for 20 long years. Tears flowed freely, and the entire room was overcome with an emotional wave that no one could contain. Reporters furiously took notes, capturing every detail of this historic moment. James watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. He had won. Despite all the threats, the attacks, the corruption, and the power his enemies had wielded, justice had finally prevailed. At that moment, the senator and his son knew the truth could no longer be contained. The walls were closing in on them, and their faces were plastered across every news outlet. James felt a wave of triumph as he thought of the imminent downfall of those who had manipulated the system for so long. Now, they would have to face their own consequences. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to see David finally walk free. Accompanied by Lisa, his children, and James, he stepped onto the courthouse steps. The sun shone on his face as he raised his hands, feeling the fresh air of the freedom that had been so long denied him. With a voice choked with emotion, David addressed the crowd. "It's been 20 years of pain, of struggle, but today, I am free. not just for myself, but for all those who have been wronged like me. I thank God, my family, and this man." He looked at James, who never stopped fighting for me. The crowd applauded, and the camera flashes lit up the unforgettable moment. James felt a wave of emotion as he listened to David's words. He knew his work there was done, but he also knew that this victory was bigger than just freeing one man. It was a victory against corruption, against a system that had failed, and against those who believed that power could hide the truth forever. As the people celebrated, James quietly slipped away, leaving the crowd to gather around David and his family. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just the victory of one case, it was a victory against a system that had so often crushed men like David, like him, for something as simple as the color of their skin. That day, he had done more than free an innocent man. He had challenged and exposed the racist structures that kept so many others unjustly incarcerated. The fight for justice never ended, he knew that. But in that moment, the satisfaction of having made a difference in someone's life who shared his own burden ran deep. This, more than anything, was what drove him. And on that day, he knew he was on the right path. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.